Reem Ibrahim, thank you so much for joining me today, political commentator and communications at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Starmer has U-turned and flip-flopped on so many issues, on everything from eco-protesters, from scrapping the uni fees, about Corbyn being his friend and then saying he wasn't. And now recently he said that he's U-turned on what a woman is, saying that a woman is actually an adult female. Can we trust anything that Starmer says? And are women's rights at risk under a Labour government?
Well, thank you, David, for having me on. And I think it is particularly interesting to see the way that Keir Starmer has sort of changed his mind on various different policies. It does feel as though the Labour Party doesn't have a clear ideological direction. Specifically when it comes to women and women's rights, I mean, I, as a woman, am pretty afraid of the way that we've sort of, as a culture, erased the word woman itself. We see people, mothers being called breastfeeders or being called chest feeders, these horrible words, and the word woman is effectively being erased. Now, that's a cultural change that is required. I wouldn't necessarily want the government to be intervening in that. But I mean, you're absolutely right. Seeing Keir Starmer intervene and sort of actually change his mind on what a woman is, sort of by definition, I think is quite sad. I would like to see more people actually agreeing that on the definition of a woman being an adult human female. When it comes to adults that are obviously transitioning, we've got to sort of, I think, be a little bit more sympathetic to those people, but it's also about protecting women's rights as a result of it. Now, just sort of broadly speaking, Keir Starmer is sort of trying to position himself as a Blairite in some ways. Yeah. And I think he believes that he sort of will be able to get that 1997 election win where they got that wonderful 179 seat majority. I don't think that we'll see that for Keir Starmer, and most of the wins that the Labour Party are receiving are actually not wins, but they are failures on the side of other parties.
Because there is a massive split, isn't there, in the Labour Party on this issue specifically. Like Ben Bradshaw, the Labour MP, is actually concerned about Starmer's position, and he wants self-ID. And then there's Mike Shanks, who's the parliamentary candidate for Margaret Ferrier's old seat, saying that he would back Scotland's gender recognition bill. So there is split in the Labour Party, isn't there, on this issue?
Absolutely, and there's always been this kind of ideological split within the Labour Party. We saw this back in the 50s with the Gateskielites and the Bevanite. It's sort of that principled ideological divide between what is effectively the centre-left and the left. But now what we've seen here is that's not just based on economic issues, but on these cultural issues like the definition of a woman, like whether or not the Gender Recognition Act should have been enacted, whether or not transgender people should be able to identify as their preferred gender and then enter bathrooms or spaces as they so please. These kind of questions are what are dividing the Labour Party, and it feels as though you have no position on economics, but they're fighting the culture war.
And also, they've speculated about even lowering the voting age to 16, and this is something that I'm really worried about. Jonathan Reynolds MP suggested proposals to lowering the voting is something that they're actually considering and they're looking at. We know that across the world, there's not many countries that have a 16 voting age. Is this the right idea? Like, obviously, then would people just be influenced by their teachers? We know there's a bias in schools, isn't there, going on?
Yeah, I mean, it's a particularly hard threshold to sort of set. When I was 16, I was a massive fan of Corbyn. So I think that might tell you a bit about how I've sort of shifted my views in those 2 years. I mean, like for me personally, on my political journey, 18, I decided to vote Conservative, whereas when I was 16, if you put a ballot paper in front of my face, I probably would have ticked Labour. Now that, I mean, tells you, something very, very small about the way that I've sort of shifted my views. Everyone is different. There are people at the age of 18 that have no idea who to vote for. We know that turnout is incredibly low amongst young people. So I would say we should be encouraging 16, 17-year-olds to become politically active, go out there and campaign, go out there and, start a TikTok account and, talk about politics and write about these things and write for the IEA's 8028 blog, get involved and get involved in these ideas, and then when you turn 18 you'll be able to actually cast that ballot. But really, if you want to get involved in politics, you don't have to just be voting in a general election. And I do think that there is, Keir Starmer wanting this or potentially floating around this idea, it is a political move. We know that the majority of young people tend to vote Labour, and if you were to reduce the voting age to 16, the majority of those people would probably also vote Labour.
Yeah, so it's kind of a tactical issue there. And then we've got the Ulez scheme, which is so controversial right now. Everyone is talking about it. And Sadiq Khan has been criticised for not listening to ordinary people throughout this whole debate. Obviously, we had the High Court ruling, which gave permission for the expansion of Ulez to be lawful. And Sadiq Khan said it was good news. It's coming in at the end of this month, on the 29th of August, where cars that are non-compliant, you'll have to pay £12.50 every time you go into London. But the RAC has said that more than 690,000 cars are currently non-compliant. That's a lot of cars there. Should the government bring in legislation to stop ULEZ, as suggested by Tory MP Craig McKinley?
Yeah, I mean, Ulez is an absolutely abhorrent scheme in my view. It's effectively a tax on the poorest and the most vulnerable people, which is ironic coming from somebody who's supposed to be from the Labour Party, and they claim that they care about the poor and the most vulnerable. It's a £12.50 effectively extra tax on those cars that are petrol and diesel, which means that they could be hybrid, but those that are fully petrol. And I really find it difficult to understand why they're expanding it across the entirety of the M25. I'm from Uxbridge in South Ruislip. We've just had the by-election, and it was a hugely controversial issue. And a lot of people sort of suggested that actually the only reason why Steve Tuckwell, the Conservative candidate, now the MP, actually won that by-election is because they fought it on ULEZ. What that really does show is that this is an incredibly pertinent issue for so many people. And we're not just talking about, middle-class people that might still have their old cars. We're talking about, people that could potentially be disabled, that can't get to their hospital appointments because they are car bound. There are so many people that are reliant on cars, and it's such a London-centric view to say that actually, well, you should just get the tube, or you should just get on public transport. That's just not feasible for so many people. And I find it incredibly ironic that the party that is supposed to be super inclusive and care about the working classes are actually actively pushing for a policy that will hurt them. Now, in terms of your question about whether or not the government should be intervening, I mean, this really is to do with whether or not we believe Sadiq Khan his intentions are actually, true. Is Sadiq Khan implementing ULEZ because he cares about the environment and clean air, or is it because he's spunked all of our taxpayer money during the pandemic and they need to raise some extra cash? I would say it's probably the latter.
It is a regressive form of taxation, as you say. It will hit people on lower incomes more. It's going to give this £2,000 grant for people, for all Londoners. But Susan Hall said that this is too little too late. And it's not actually affecting people that are actually outside of London, that are then commuting into London. Is this gonna be enough support to help people upgrade their vehicles?
No, I mean, it's totally ridiculous. We're going to charge you an extra £12.50 a day to drive your car, but here's an extra £2,000 so you can change your car type. I mean, it really is like sort of stupid policy making, if you don't mind me saying. It's sort of like we're going to be charging you more money for one thing, but actually, it's sort of the carrot and the stick in the same policy. What we need to do is be encouraging people to switch to electric vehicles themselves. People are already doing it at an incredibly high rate. Also, actually make sure that public infrastructure works. There are people that will prefer to use TfL over driving. Actually make that more feasible, expand it. Unfortunately, Sadiq Khan, over the course of the pandemic, bankrupted TfL not once, not twice, but 3 times. So I really don't necessarily trust his leadership with public finances. I would like to see, not this is sort of £2,000 of taxpayer money being spent on people. It's just ridiculous. That's what the money should be used for. Instead, we should be scrapping ULEZ and allowing people to make those decisions for themselves.
And we've heard from Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party. She said in a Sky interview that you've got to remember that ULEZ is coming to towns and cities across the UK. Are Labour on the side of motorists, or is there a concern that actually they could expand this scheme all over the country?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing this across, I think it's Oxford, they've got the LTNs, and we've seen people protesting those kind of policies. This really isn't just a London-centric issue. The reason why it's so London-centred, though, is because it's Sadiq Khan as London Mayor who's sort of spearheading this policy. There's talk of it sort of being implemented in cities like Manchester and Liverpool. I mean, it's effectively, taxing those individuals that are probably more vulnerable, that probably have less money, which is why they weren't able to switch to electric car vehicles in the first place. But actually what it really just shows that actually this kind of craze around environmentalism is taking precedence over, people and the cost of living crisis. And the irony is that in a time where we do have a cost of living crisis, and the government claim that they care about how much they're, how high prices are and how high inflation is, and then yet they're implementing these kind of policies. It's awful. It's sad to see from the Labour Party side, at least, and I would like to see it scrapped. I don't think that it will happen if we're still pushing this environmentalism. We've got to be clear, Ulez isn't necessarily that effective when it comes to cleaning up London's air. What is effective is allowing people to switch themselves voluntarily. I also just think it's immoral that the government are trying to get them to do that themselves anyway.
Then we've got the net zero plans, which have been very controversial as well. And lots of people on both sides have been speaking out about this. Michael Gove specifically has said that this net zero ban for 2030 for the sale of new petrol and diesel cars is immovable. But the EU's date is actually at 2035, so it's even later than ours. Priti Patel has spoken out on GB News, and she said that we should pause all net zero targets. Would you agree with Dame Priti Patel on this one?
Yeah, I mean, I would scrap all the net zero targets. I think that what we need to see is not a government top-down, position on environmental change. What we need is for businesses and for consumers to make those decisions for themselves. And unfortunately, the government doing this top-down issue just isn't what's going to solve the crisis. I do believe that global warming is happening. I believe that it's an important issue that we need to be talking about. And I have a lot of sympathy for those people that do advocate for those things, but government top-down targets are not the solution. For example, you've got the target for the ban on petrol cars by 2030. It's a blanket approach. Instead, what we need is to establish the infrastructure so that people are able to make the switches to cars that are more environmentally friendly.
Because there isn't the technology, is there, at the minute? And I've seen queues of cars for all the charging points across the country. And we have the former Chancellor, Philip Hammond, saying that politicians are actually not being honest with the public on how much net zero is costing. I think he said it's going to cost £1 trillion. It's a lot of money, which will be put onto taxpayers as well.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of money, and it's effectively the government artificially putting up prices as a result of these environmentalist policies. It does feel like virtue signalling, partly as a result of our commitments that we made whilst we were in the EU, but also as a result of global commitments. We've got to remember the UK, in terms of sort of global emissions, we sort of emit a very small percentage of that. We've actually reduced global emissions by huge percentages, and the fact that the government now feel as though we need to be prioritizing environmental policies that actually won't make much of an impact globally over effectively, helping those people that are most vulnerable, the working classes, but also how high the tax burden already is. We've already got the highest tax burden since the Second World War. So we're already implementing these policies that are crushing businesses, crushing people, and crushing effectively the incentive to work hard in this country. And I think that it's unfortunate. The government really need to rethink net zero policies.
Because we have 1% of the global emissions, and China and India, they're the biggest polluters in the world. Like, we should be targeting them, surely, with all of this.
Yeah, and I think we should be really using international pressure to target them. I do think that there is a sort of somewhat of a double standard here when it comes to environmentalism, where the United Kingdom, we were able to go through our industrial revolution during the 19th century, early 20th century. We were able to emit as many greenhouse gases as we so pleased, and yet when these countries in the third world are developing, especially I'm specifically talking about India, when they're developing, or these African countries are developing, we're effectively saying you'll have to sort of abide by our environmental policies that we've now established, but we didn't abide by those kind of rules when we were developing. So I do think there is a double standard. There needs to be international pressure, but also investment in that kind of technology that allows people to make the smart decisions in order for us to reduce global emissions as a whole.
Yeah, and then one of Sunak's key 5 pledges at the minute is to stop the boats. And last year we saw nearly 46,000 people cross the channel to the UK. This year already it's been over 14,000. We know the Tories have successfully passed the Illegal Migration Act, which gives the Home Secretary a legal duty to detain and remove anyone entering the UK illegally. But have the Conservatives done enough to stop the boats? We've seen this farce with the Bibby Stockholm. It's been delayed again this week, and it's going to host 500 illegal migrants who are men, but it still hasn't happened. And is that the solution to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, the illegal migration bill is sort of a separate issue. I think the way that it's given the Home Office those kind of powers hasn't necessarily been effective. I'm generally pretty pro-immigration. We've got 5.3 million people on adult benefits, and we've got huge amounts of vacancies. We need people to be filling those vacancies, and if it's not British people, it's got to be someone. Otherwise, we can kiss goodbye to growth. The problem here is illegal immigration, and the Home Office have completely and utterly failed on this front, on all fronts when it comes to immigration. The Home Office backlog is over 170,000. That's up by about 70,000 since last July. It's huge, the amount of failures that they've experienced, and actually what really needs to happen is for us to get through that backlog so that the government can then actually decide who, now at the moment when people are coming to this country illegally, they're being put on those waiting lists straight away, and those applications aren't being processed for years to come. So it's really important that we get through that backlog first. It's the most important priority.
Because on that barge, we know there's 500 people on it, but 686 people crossed the channel in July on one day. The left don't really want this to work. The Court of Appeal ruled against the Rwanda policy, and they all voted against the illegal migration bill, Labour did. We saw the Daily Mail did this investigation as well, with lawyers paying £10,000 to help with fake asylum claims. Is the left trying to just make it difficult to tackle migration in this country?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fundamentally about whether or not immigration is good for the country as a whole. Yeah. It's illegal migration that's the problem. I don't think that the Labour Party themselves necessarily care too much about wanting to encourage more immigration. I don't believe that Keir Starmer, for example, is pro open borders. He'd be stupid too politically, but also I don't believe that he is that stupid in terms of his own migration policy. What we are seeing though is bureaucracy getting in the way. And the fact that the Home Office have been unable to get through that backlog of 170,000 has been growing over the past year, and of course throughout the course of the pandemic. The fact that the Home Office have failed, I think, does tell you there's something more going on. That the Home Office bureaucracy, the civil servants potentially themselves might be causing that slowage. There's also an element of the fact that they probably need to hire more people to get rid of the asylum backlog. Clearly, the current system isn't working, and the Home Office need to take accountability for how horribly they failed.
And we've seen on the local economy and local communities, this barge, the Bibby Stockholm, there was £400,000 that's been lost for a cruise ship not being able to dock in Portland. We know the people that will go on the barge, might be next week, whenever it is, are going to get access to free excursions, including cycling and cricket matches, access to a gym and onboard healthcare facilities. Is this fair on the local communities that are living around outside the barge, because they're struggling to get face-to-face doctor's appointments, and some campaigners and locals have admitted to waiting up to 6 weeks for a blood test even?
Yeah, I mean, healthcare issues in this country are a sort of a separate issue that I could get into if you want me to. The NHS is systematically failing, and we need to completely reform the system. On sort of the Bibby Stockholm barge itself, we saw a lot. I mean, I think it was last week, there was a lot of just conversations about why it wasn't being opened. First of all, they said that the ports didn't want to open it, didn't want to start a new project on Wednesday, they wanted to wait until Monday. Then they said, I think it was that they wanted to, there's a fire safety issue. Yes. I mean, that specific issue, I think, is, there are so many government failures when it comes to the way that the government have been spending this money on facilities to allow migrants to stay. Fundamentally, this wouldn't be a problem if the backlog wasn't so long. If we knew, where these people were going to go, whether they were going to be granted asylum or if they were going to be deported, if we knew what was going to happen to them, they wouldn't have to be in this temporary accommodation in the first place. The government need to get through this backlog first and foremost. Now, whether or not it's fair that these illegal migrants are put up in taxpayer-funded hotels and given all of these sort of benefits, of course it's not fair. It's unfair to see those people do that. It's also unfair for those that have fled war. I'm not saying all of them have. We know that 1 in 4 that came last year were from a safe country like Albania, but there are those that have fled war, and I think that in itself is unfair. The government have wasted taxpayer money in many elements here. I don't think this is necessarily one of those, though.
Because we're spending 6 million a day on hotels, which is probably more than we're spending on homeless people. And in Wales specifically, there was a 4-star hotel called the Stradley Park Hotel, which sacked 95 of its staff members to actually put in place plans to allow 240 asylum seekers or legal migrants to stay there. That's not fair to put that on the local community as well.
Yeah, and I think we saw with, I think Richard Tice was interviewing some migrants that came to a hotel in Pimlico. I would love to stay in a free hotel in Pimlico. I could just walk to the office rather than have my daily commute. I mean, it is quite sad to see this waste of taxpayer money. The solution, though, is to reduce that backlog.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.